I am so pleased to get to announce Jiminy and Dave's Excellent CSS Adventure, which I think will be as excellent and adventurous as promised. I'm also told it will be covering a large range of CSS for you folks. Jiminy Pinose is a freelancer who has been helping French publishers make the transition to digital for the last 5 years. In addition to ebook conversion, he has conducted QA audits, managed interactive projects, built custom tools, and designed tailored workflows for his clients. He's also the creator and maintainer of open source projects dedicated to ebooks, including the Blitz framework and Redium CSS. Dave Kramer has been making ebooks for umpteen years and complaining about ebook standards for nearly as long. He was co-editor of the IDPF specification on fixed layout ebooks, but in recent years has become heavily involved with the W3C and web standards, editing several specs for the CSS working group and writing requirements for Latin text layout and pagination for the Digital Publishing Interest Group. When not doing standards work, Dave writes XSL, works on typesetting with HTML and CSS, hunts for interesting information in mountains of XML files, and skis up and down literal mountains, preferably in Canada. He dreams of bringing the rich history of print design and typography to ebooks and the web. Please welcome Jiminy and Dave.
That's mine.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Nice work. I was going to say it wasn't mine. So I might as well start at the beginning. In the beginning, the director created the canvas, and the canvas was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the spirit of the director moved upon the face of the screen. And the director said, "Let there be content," and there was content. And the director saw the content, that it was good, and the director divided the content from the style. And the director called the content the document tree, and the darkness he called style. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And Bert said, "Let there be a box tree in the midst of the canvas, and let it unite the document tree and the style." And Bert made a document and rendered the fragmentainers of the box tree onto the canvas, and it was so. And the director called the document valid, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And Bert said, "Let the maker of standards be gathered together unto one place, and let the standard appear," and it was so. And Bert called the standard cascading style sheets, and the gathering together of the makers called he the CSS working group, and the director saw that it was good. The director, of course, is Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. Bert is Bert Boss, the co-inventor of CSS. And what I like about that very first bit of the CSS 2.1 specification is that it says explicitly what it's for. By separating the presentation style of documents from the content of documents, CSS simplifies web authoring and site maintenance. Bert was afraid that HTML would evolve to be unreadable and unsemantic because of the demands of design. Remember all the font tags and stuff from the old days? So what is CSS? CSS is a strange mixture of magic and rectangular boxes. It's as if Dumbledore lived in a world that consisted entirely of boxes. Minecraft meets Flatland. But CSS is magic. The magician must know the proper incantation and recite it perfectly. Just as in the tales of genies and bottles, you often get what you asked for instead of what you wanted. Like magic, CSS is subtle, sometimes mysterious, and can get you in a lot of trouble. That's why we're here, to take you on a magical journey, casting spells on books to make them beautiful and irresistible, to warn you about the pitfalls that may lurk ahead, to help you understand this strange language. Let's go have an adventure. So we forget that CSS is everywhere. Even if we don't write any style sheet, our content will still be styled with CSS. Your browser or ebook reading system has a user agent style sheet that determines the default rendering of HTML. There's CSS for every element, even if it doesn't look fancy. And the user agent style sheet is always there, interacting with your styles. So it's kind of important to know about. Using dev tools tells you a lot. Not only do we see the user agent style sheet in action here, We also see the reading system has injected a whole bunch of stuff into your content. This is the dreaded reading system override, and this is what Jiminy does for a living.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can see that well, but you've got some inline styles in there for paragraphs. So you have data origin font size equals 16 and style font size 16 pixel. That's to show although that simple things we take for granted like font size and lineate, we'll come back to that later, are super complex to deal with. This is Radium 1. This is what you'll get in the Chromium app. And as you can see, that add inline styles to manage font size properly. It's one of those things I took 3 weeks to manage in Radium CSS. For instance, my life was miserable, really. And then I found some blog posts from a Firefox engineer. I don't know if you've seen Firefox lately. They changed their rendering engine. And his blog post was about, well, font size is the worst. And this is the moment I felt Schadenfreude, because I could rejoice that even though I had to go through hell myself, he had a death match with Satan in hell. So yeah, what we can say about that, and it was pretty popular in the Moby days, I guess. You know the keywords for font size, medium, large, small, and stuff like that? They are painful. Don't use them anymore. Use relative units, really. Everyone will thank you for this, especially users.
So I want to talk a little bit about how CSS works behind the scenes. First of all, we have our HTML, which forms this tree, the document object model. For each element in the tree, we have to find all the style declarations that apply from all these different style sheets. If more than one of these declarations applies, then you have to resolve this conflict based on the rules of the cascade, depending on where the rule came from, whether it was bang important, and how specific the rule is. On the other hand, if the property isn't declared in a style sheet, you have to figure out the value of the property through inheritance if the property inherits, or through the initial value of the property if it doesn't inherit. Everything in CSS has an initial value if you don't change it. And so the goal is to get this specified value for every CSS property, and then you can do layout. I want to take a quick look how layout works in not a whole lot of detail, but we can sort of take a peek at that unstyled page and see what the browser does. We have the tree of elements, we have the styles applied to them. So we start with an HTML element, which the user agent style sheet says this is display block. Display is like gender. If you don't pay attention, you think there are only 2 choices, block and inline. But if you look closely, the world is rather more complicated. More on that later. We have a block element. We draw a rectangle. By default, everything is sort of as wide as the screen. We don't know how tall it is because we don't know what the content is going to be like. This is sort of how layout works. We usually know how wide something is going to be, but not how tall, because we sort of have to put all the content in place to see how big the box is going to be. And that other piece is, the parent creates a box, and then we go through all the children and see how they contribute to things. So the first child of HTML is the head element. You look at the user agent style sheet, it says head is display none, so we don't have to draw a box. The other child is body. The UA style sheet says display block, and it has a margin. So we take the width of the screen, we subtract the margin, we make the box that size, then we process the children. Section is display block, but doesn't do anything else. Then we have an H1. H1 is still display block, but it has font size of 2 M's. And here's how font sizes get a little complicated. An M is defined as the computed value of the font size on an element. If you said the H1 was 20 pixels, then 1em would be 20 pixels. But we don't have any pixel value to work with, so we have to go look to the parent. Is there a pixel value on the font size for section? No, not on body, not even on HTML. We have to go find the default font value of your browser, which is usually 16 pixels, but you can change it. And then that inherits back down to the H1, and we finally figure out the font size is 2 times 16 pixels or 32 pixels. And then, we actually draw the text. Then we have a paragraph, again, display block. It has some margins. We make a box, and then we put the text in it. Laying out the text inside the paragraph is inline layout, and that has its own complications.
Yeah, that's really a tough process because you can't assume anything. The first thing we did for Medium CSS was to take a look at user agents style sheets from popular web browsers and rendering engines. So that's WebKit, Blink, Edge HTML, and Firefox. And we were pleased that they were reliable. We didn't have to change anything, to patch anything to get a consistent experience across browsers. But don't assume anything because some reading systems will obviously add their own styles.
So I wanted to mention a bit about the cascade. The cascade gets a bad name. People who consider themselves computer scientists complain about global variables and bitch about scope. JavaScript kiddies hate CSS and HTML and want to spend their days typing arrows and dot this, dot that. But the cascade is brilliant and allows you to design a publication with a very few rules and tweak anything you want without messing with the overall structure. Consider this simplest of style sheets. This turns web style paragraphs with margins above and below and no indents into book style paragraphs with indents. But it does this so brilliantly. A paragraph after a head or a block won't have an indent. You don't have to define a whole bunch of special cases. You don't have to put class equals no indent everywhere. It just works. The glory and power of CSS, the magical part, is the cascade. A few simple rules applying to hundreds of different things. But the biggest problem I see in my CSS and the CSS I help people with is that the rules we think are applying aren't actually applying. As with magic, it matters who utters the spell, where it originates from. The reader, the author, the user agent, Gandalf, Hermione, Ged. So which rules apply? That depends on 2 things: where the rule came from, its origin, and how specific the rule is. We've mentioned all these different, user agent style sheet, the author style sheet, which we make, and then the user can customize things. It's usually buttons, but we conceptually think of it as style sheets. The basic idea is the author gets priority for normal styles, but the user can override the author if needed. My needs as a reader outweigh your needs as a designer, especially if accessibility is at risk.
The thing is, the web has tried user settings through style sheets, and it didn't work that well. I guess you can tell about that, Dave, that it didn't work at all. So actually, reading systems are quite way ahead on user settings, because what you've got in the Chrome of reading apps basically is a graphical user interface to writing a user style sheet. And what's difficult is to do some arbitration. What does the user think is important and what is not? And it's all relative, because you may need font normalization with no italics, no bold, and stuff like that. And suddenly it becomes important, because you can't read that otherwise, and to you.
Yeah, people like to illustrate the different order of precedence of these different style sheets, like in terms of war. Like there's a site that does this with Star Wars characters. But I think it's more like the order of precedence for British royalty. It's not like some style sheets are literally more powerful. We just agree that they have precedence. So the lowest precedent rules, the user agent normal, comes from Autumn Phillips. Yes, she's Canadian, and Canada always comes last. User normal rules, yes, then author normal rules. Then comes author important, which can be overridden by Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, and of course, the Queen always has the last word.
And we can say that some reading systems really love the Queen and will important everything. And that doesn't help the ecosystem, basically, because content providers will sometimes start to do some clever CSS tricks and stuff like that. And then every other reading system has to manage that. And it creates interrupt and compat issues. You have to review user settings and find ways to override that again. So it's a complete nightmare. And it will be good if the reading systems trying to be the queen would take some time to think about that.
But even if there are still multiple rules applying to some element with the same origin and importance, then we look at specificity. The most specific selector wins. You know, ID selectors are more specific than attribute or class selectors, which are more specific than just plain element selectors. And sometimes we have really complex selectors, so you have to keep track of, you know, how many, in a given rule, how many selectors are of a given type. You know, a Prince Charles plus 3 Prince Andrews beats a Prince Charles with only 2 Prince Andrews. But 1 Queen Elizabeth beats 10,000 Prince Charleses. And no, I have never before wondered what the plural of Prince Charles was. Is it princes, Charleses? And finally, this is John Stephen Akwari. He fell less than halfway through the 1968 Olympic marathon, dislocating his knee and injuring his shoulder. Nevertheless, he persisted, arriving in the stadium after dark and after most spectators had left. But unlike the Olympics, last always wins. If several different declarations in a CSS file have the same origin, importance, and specificity, the last one in the file wins. I've solved many a weird CSS problem just by moving a declaration to the end of the file.
So yeah, let's take some examples because we wanted it to be practical. So space breaks is something you'll find a lot in books, either in the form of an empty line or an asterism or dinkus. And so you have to use the horizontal rule in HTML5 to achieve that. And this will look like this at first, that's the user agent style sheet.
Yeah, I mean, we want to use HR for space breaks because of accessibility, but this is not usually the visual appearance we want, although it's not as horrible as some things I've seen on the web. Maybe we can put in like a lovely ornament. So to do that, we have to we have 2 steps. One, we have to sort of suppress the default rendering of the horizontal rule, and then we put in the ornament. You know, and at the top there, I put what the user agent style sheet defines for horizontal rule. It's actually a 1-pixel gray border. And so if we set the border width to 0, then we make the rule go away. And then now we took that away, we have to put something in its place. We can use one of my favorite things, a pseudo element. Colon before is technically a tree abiding pseudo element, which is one of the coolest phrases in any CSS spec. Here we're looking at it in DevTools. It's in the element tree. It really is an element, sort of. You know, we're using CSS to insert this node in the DOM. It appears as a child of the HR element. It inherits all the inheritable properties of the parent, although I believe the technical term is originating element. And then we can just style that with the content property and put in an ornament from Poetica, which is one of my favorite fonts. Now let's do something more interesting with our chapter openers. Behold the power of OpenType fonts.
Yeah, that should be of interest to publishers.
Yeah.
OpenType features.
I like this because you can make things beautiful with very little risk. If the reading system didn't support this stuff, you know, it's not going to break your layout. It's just going to look a little more boring. You don't have to mess with your markup. This is Zapfino, which is an interesting font to test things with because it breaks all sorts of assumptions. It has, there's basically thousands of alternate characters in here or organized into these stylistic sets. That's why there's an SSO5. You know, this is 5 different stylistic sets of the same font, you know, all done with basically one line of CSS.
Yeah, and the thing with CSS is that it's fault tolerant. So if a reading system or user agent doesn't know about CSS property, it will simply ignore it. So leverage that because it's very powerful. Some stuff will break in Adobe's RMS SDK. That's for sure.
Surprise.
But usually for stuff like font feature settings and the most modern properties, they will simply be removed.
I mean, I think that's one of the great things about HTML and CSS is that they defined into the language what to do with unknown stuff. If you have something unknown in HTML, by default, it's set to display inline, and you just display the contents of the thing. You could put a tag ebookcraft in an HTML document, and every browser in the world would know how to display that. Same with CSS. If you have an unknown declaration, it just gets skipped. So this allows the language to evolve without breaking everything that existed before it. This is a lesson that we're maybe trying to teach to EPUB these days. Here's another useful trick, the magical display inline block. Say we want a nice rule on our chapter opener, but it extends all the way across the page. That looks horrible. We could try to put a margin, but we don't know how long the text is going to be. That's better. All we did was change display from block to inline block. It sort of acts like a block on the inside, but the outside world sees it as inline. Margins work, but stuff can flow around it.
And yeah, you can also do that for lists. So the pseudo elements again, you can actually customize the marker for the list style type.
Yeah, this is something that came up at work a few weeks ago. We needed checkboxes for lists, and I hate trying to use images or something. So same sort of idea. We get rid of the default rendering with list style type none. We add a checkbox with a before pseudo element, and then we just sort of patch up the margins. So now one of the big topics in CSS, centering.
Yeah. How many of you search every day how to center things in CSS? Vertically, I mean. None of you? Okay. That's a running joke, running gag.
Yeah, centering things in CSS does seem to be a running joke, which is unfortunate because horizontal centering has never been a problem if you understand the basics. And there's lots of different ways of doing vertical centering these days, ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous. Say we want to center a dedication like this vertically and horizontally. We have a paragraph inside a section with EPUB type of declaration. Note our kind of clever attribute selector. The little tilde equals thing means this will work whenever the string dedication is in the class attribute. So it would still work if we called this EPUB type, dedication front matter. To center the text horizontally, we just use text align because that's what centers inline stuff. In this case, one way to center it vertically is to set the top margin to half the height and then move the content up by half of the content's height with a CSS transform, which puts the center of the content in the middle of the screen. But you all know how this story goes. Most reading systems don't support CSS transforms. Yay, Redium. Thank you, Jiminy.
Oh, I did nothing. It's all Chromium, so you can thank Google.
The easiest way you could do this is with how you would do it on the web these days, which is Flexbox. This is part of the recent revolution in CSS layout. For the longest time we had block layout, inline layout, table layout, and floats, but Flex is new, designed to deal with sort of one-dimensional problems like menu bars or app controls. Flex items can grow or shrink to fill space, and they can align themselves in every possible way. So here we just set the container, the section, to 100% to the full height of the screen. That's what we're centering in. Then we just say, use Flex layout, align items centers vertically, and justify content centers horizontally. That was really easy.
Yeah, and I guess those properties, which are handled by the browser, are very future-proof because you don't have to rely on nasty CSS hacks and stuff like that. It's all on the browser and rendering engine, and you don't even have to think about it.
So here's one of those nasty hacks for the same thing. You set the section to the height of the screen as before, but then we put in this ghost pseudo element, make it as tall as our section, set it to inline block, use vertical align middle, and then do the same thing in the paragraph, and it's somehow, although I'm not sure I would want to try to explain this to anyone, it actually centers the stuff. It's way harder to understand than Flex or transforms.
Oh, the original scene of Adobe's digital editions.
Yeah.
Auto margins.
Yeah, it's like, in general, text align can center inline elements. That's how sometimes it seems to magically work on IMG, because IMG is in the user agent style sheet is display inline. But it doesn't work on blocks. For that, you use margin auto. Again, one of my 4 favorite CSS tricks: inline block, margin auto, one we're going to get to in the future, and moving stuff to the end of the file to make it more specific.
And one interesting thing is that it works with vertical writing mode. So you will have margin top and margin bottom, which are automatically computed. I was pleasantly surprised to discover that when we did, what's the word I can't pronounce well?
Internationalization.
Thank you. When I did that, because it was quite a nightmare to implement vertical writing mode in Medium CSS.
Jiminy only brought me to this presentation so that I could say internationalization for him. So images, a subject near and dear to all our hearts. Most common thing in the world, full page image. This is a book cover. We want the image to be as big as possible without the horrific idea of changing its aspect ratio and distorting it. There's a CSS property for exactly that, object fit. The value object fit contains means fill the space as much as you can and don't distort anything.
Yeah, that's one trick iBooks have been using for a very long time. And once again, don't assume that because one reading system works with your CSS, it will work everywhere else. That's part, actually, of the user agent styles. And when you start doing pagination in reading systems, you have to put safeguards in place so that images don't overflow on the next page and stuff like that. And object fit is typically something you will find to get around this issue. But you can use it in your books to make sure we manage that well.
Yeah, and so we do more boring things in our books because some things still don't support cool, useful properties like that, but this only works for portrait because it sort of depends on the aspect ratio of the image. Here's one of my favorite things. This is a little holy grail experience of keeping a figure and caption together no matter how the type size of the caption changes. So if I make the caption, if I change the user setting in my reading system and the caption gets bigger, the image just shrinks a little bit to use up the same amount of space. This is Flexbox for the win. We make the figure a flex container. It flexes in the vertical direction. Flexbox is one-dimensional. The image is a flex item, so it can scale. We just set the minimum height of it to half the screen size because we don't want the image getting too tiny. Object fit contain prevents the image from distorting. I am really looking forward to a future where things like this work.
Yeah. And you can do a lot of stuff, clever stuff with CSS selectors. Maybe some of you have been implementing selectors depending on EPUB types. I remember seeing that last year during a workshop. But there are a lot of other selectors you can use to do some cool stuff in one-liners.
Yeah, I also like, using sort of selectors relatively cleverly because you can usually avoid having to mess with your markup. Use CSS to select something instead of, putting zillions of class attributes everywhere. Here's a super simple case, just shading alternate rows of a table. We just use an nth child selector. Again, one line gives us a useful visual effect.
And once again, if it's not supported, that will degrade gracefully. So
exactly.
So that's the important idea, I guess. We're doing some progressive enhancement in some ways.
Here's another one. Say we want to visually distinguish different types of links in our document. Internal links to our EPUB, good. They don't throw us out of the book. Links going outside of the web, bad. So we just, we can use an attribute value selector. If an href starts with HTTP, make it red and put poo after it. If it doesn't, make it blue and put a baseball after it. The most happy object any of us here can think of.
Yeah, one interesting part of it is colon not to target something which is not what you're putting inside. So you can isolate classes and stuff like that. And you could have headings, say, with a style set, SS05, and have a class of front matter or back matter. And for this one, use not, and it will style everything except the ones with the classes.
So yesterday, Peter mentioned using CSS to check accessibility. So here we're putting a red border around images that don't have an alt attribute and an orange border if the alt attribute is empty. Laura, the woman on the left is Larissa Bathgate. She was the Blue Jays mascot, Diamond. This guy was leading a group of University of Toronto students to a Jays game, and he had face paint on and everything. The mascot came and sat on his lap during the game, and now they're married. This may be the single most obscure Blue Jays reference possible.
Also, now I know what I'm doing wrong.
In this case, these selectors aren't really that complicated. We're using, not an attribute. If this attribute isn't here, put the red border. If the attribute is empty, put the orange border. That's relatively straightforward. Finally, let's look a little bit at the crazy world of inline layout. For someone who started his career in his publishing career as a typesetter, this is the most painful slide imaginable. The asterisk in the fourth line of text is screwing up the line spacing. I can't even look at it. Oh, I can breathe again.
This is what brought me to e-production, actually.
Really?
Yeah, because it was so painful to read books with this broken line 8.
So I fixed this with a single line, and this is sort of my fourth magic trick. I set the line height for the superscript to 0, but why does this work? It's kind of complicated. First, I want to talk a little bit about font metrics. Fonts extend both above and below the baseline. So a given font has sort of a number associated with it, the metric. There's an ascender and a descender. Add those two things, and that's sort of how much vertical space the font takes up. So when CSS lays out lines, you see the blue bar here is sort of the ascent plus descent. That's how much space the font takes up according to the font designer. And then, this thing they call L, take how far apart the lines are. As a print person, I think of that as baseline to baseline. Subtract, the distance between the lines, subtract out the the blue part that the font takes up, and what's left is essentially literally the leading, how thick a strip of lead you would have to put in between these lines in order to get the spacing right. And the weird thing about CSS is it doesn't put, it takes half the spacing and puts it on top of the line, half the spacing and put it on the bottom of the line. That's called the half leading model, and that's one of the original sins of CSS. They would have done line layout very differently had they known what was going to happen. You can sort of see it more clearly in this ransom note effect. I set some spans with background colors and just use like different fonts and different font sizes and font weights. And you can see how essentially it's saying, I'm using up different amounts of space in this line. And what CSS says is, my number one goal is not to hide anything and not to cover anything up. I don't want to overlap content unless you really, really tell me to. And so it just says, oh, I need room for all these varying height lines. And so it just spaces the line apart a little bit so that all those boxes fit. When I say line height 0, I'm saying, wait a minute, sort of don't think about that when you do this. Don't add all this extra space. I know what I'm doing. Just ignore the contribution to the line box from this particular character. And I do that, and you see with line height 0, various bad things happen, but we fixed our leading.
But the most interesting part, I guess, is that this little tab on the second picture, which shows that even you have to consult specs when you do CSS. And this is surprising as you are an editor of all the specs.
Yes, never has it been more true that the devil are in the details than in CSS. And that's what we have to start, but we really wanted to leave a bunch of time for questions. So fire away, and we will run and hide because the questions will be too hard.
So when I'm doing accessibility testing for people, one of the big problems I run into all the time is that in order to make something look fancy and modern, they use the before and after pseudo classes, they hide the element, and then they use the before and after pseudo classes to put like something, like an icon font or something on the page. So I don't know, it looks fancy. And like I've just been saying, okay, if you must do that, first thing I say is, you should always have text labels because people don't understand icons. But if you must do that, like I've just been telling them to use ARIA to label it. Is there a better way?
Well, I've been involved in a few discussions about the content property in CSS in general. It's something that's really easily abused. Mm-hmm. I could put, H1 before chapter 1 loomings. I could move all the content of a whole document into content properties in CSS, and that would be a disaster for accessibility. One thing we're working on is that, at least in the most recent version of the appropriate spec, we're actually going to have sort of alt text for the generated content directly in CSS. I don't think there's an implementation of that yet, but the CSS working group is also starting to work on their accessibility mappings, which is someone that, of all the people in this room, I can think of probably 2 people who understand this, and Svea is one of them, because it's sort of been unclear whether, like, does generated content appear in the accessibility tree or not. Ultimately it sort of should. And so there are definitely issues that we are aware of these issues and are trying to solve them.
I can tell you that in the ARIA working group, there's a CSS accessibility task force. I don't know exactly what they're working on. I do know that they're working on something, though.
We'll find out.
About Flexbox. So I didn't know anything supported Flexbox, and yet you were showing Flex.
Yeah,
so what systems do, and the follow-up is, do they also support grids?
I think every modern browser
Yeah.
supports Flex now.
Browsers, but
Yeah,
E-reading.
and so like a lot of, I was making screenshots out of, Readium Cloud Reader.
Yeah, and one important part is that modern reading apps are relying on web views on iOS and Android, for instance. And so that's a web browser without all the Chrome, URL bar and stuff like that, previous and next button. So they're basically using the latest version of the web browser, so Safari, Chrome, Firefox, and stuff like that. So every modern reading app using a web view or running in a browser, like the one we used for the slides, supports Flexbox.
Yeah, Grid is a little behind Flexbox. I think it's getting to every browser right about now.
Yeah.
My strongest recommendation on anything about CSS, and especially modern CSS, is to go follow Jen Simmons and Rachel Andrews. They are beyond brilliant, and they know more than everything. And they've also been doing a lot of work on how to take advantage of these new layout modes while, with progressive enhancement, setting up so it will, even if you're looking at something in Internet Explorer 7 or all our reading systems, which are the EPUB equivalents of IE7 or something,
And they have a lot.
so that you will still get a decent user experience. But as the technology advances and as support for these spreads throughout the ecosystem, you can take advantage of these great new tools.
Yeah. And Jen Simmons has a lot of stuff which is publishing related. She's taking example from Bauhaus and stuff like that. So it's definitely interesting to check that when you're a publisher, because there's so many things you can do right now that weren't possible like 5 years ago. And with the advent of web publications, you'll be able to do a lot of stuff which is frustrating right now in reading systems.
Yeah, a great thing about Jen is that she's really interested in design and like moving, the web is sort of suffering from a bunch of cookie cutter design right now. You can almost imagine, there's that giant image with the weird scroll effect, and then, there's the 3 little columns at the bottom, and every website looks exactly the same right now, and she's fighting that trend, reading cool Japanese design books from the 1940s and Bauhaus and modernist stuff.
So, my question, actually I have 2 related questions. So first one, sometime as a content creator, I find that the current CSS cannot create the content, cannot generate the content I want. For example, sometimes you want to put a background image in the page spread mode. You want to put one background image on the left side, the other one on the right side, and repeatedly use them in different ways. Well, it's just an example, but I want to know, in this case, how can we post, or how can we put our request, and how can we make proposal for CSS to the working group, and maybe to talk with the UA to implement such a feature.
Yeah, a couple things. I think the fundamental problem we face in CSS and reading systems is that problem of pagination in general. That's not something the web has done historically, and the whole, the whole foundational model of how the web works doesn't necessarily account for that. EPUB reading systems in general have had to hack that mostly by using multi-column layout, which then a lot of the problems we see in EPUB reading systems are because, multi-column layout interacting with all these other things is both somewhat underspecified and under-tested, and so we run into lots of bugs. As far as, proposals for being able to do the things that we want to do, talk to me, since I'm on the CSS working group, and I can give you more direct advice on who might be interested and how we come up with proposals and ideas.
And in the shorter term, I guess that if we improve multi-call a little bit to fix at least the biggest issues and bugs, that's Rachel Andrew once again. So she's welcoming feedback from the ebook community, because she knows that we're using that extensively to do pagination in reading systems.
And if anybody wants to like make $1 billion and start their own browser that's sort of optimized for the needs of publishers, come talk to me.
Yeah, and you can start from Opera 12, something like that.
Opera 12.16, yes, the high point of the web.
They had pagination in place at that point.
It also had really interesting, it supported a bunch of other interesting features. I can make a pretty nice ebook reader out of stock Opera 12.16.
I think my second related question is, so sometime when we want to create some, like you said, we found a lot of different way to do the same thing. For example, the way you showed to replace the pseudo, to use the pseudo element in the HR. I also can see a lot of content, for example, use image in that case. So my question is there any way as content creator we can ask for the best practice for the use case we have? Maybe some community group in WCC or maybe out of WCC.
Yeah, I think the EPUB 3 community group is actively working on best practices for these things. Yeah, and so we'll try to sort some of that thing out. I do think one of the strengths of CSS is, sort of like Perl, there's more than one way to do it. And, given the varying requirements based on our content, based on who we distribute our content to, the same solution may not work for everybody, which makes our lives more complicated, admittedly. But if we weren't used to these horrible dilemmas, we wouldn't be in ebooks. Oh, we have 3, 2, 1, and we're done.
Thanks.